The rain came down in cold, metallic sheets over the ruined villages of North Africa, turning the desert dust into a gritty brown paste that clung to boots and tank treads alike. The smell of cordite, oil, and fear hung in the air like a living thing. From a distance came the low growl of German engines, a panzer column pushing through the night, confident, relentless, and certain of its reputation for perfection. But there, somewhere beyond the smoke and chaos, was a man whose name had begun to circulate among German troops like a whispered curse. Allen, they said. Terrible Terry Allen. To them, he wasn't just another American officer. He was the wild-eyed general who refused to fight by the book, the commander who turned every battlefield into a brawl, every retreat into an ambush, every moment of calm into the prelude to chaos. Even before dawn broke, his men knew that the next few hours would write themselves into legend. What made Allen different wasn't merely his courage. It was the unnerving, unpredictable rhythm with which he fought. When the Germans thought he would pull back, he lunged. When they assumed he'd dig in, he went on the offensive. His soldiers, the hard-bitten veterans of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, followed him with something approaching devotion, because he demanded nothing from them that he didn't demand from himself. He bled with them, ate with them, cursed beside them, and most dangerously for the enemy, believed that fear was a weapon that belonged to him, not to the Germans. To understand how one American general could terrify an army that had swept across Europe, you have to begin with the man himself, an unlikely hero, a misfit in uniform, and perhaps the most audacious battlefield leader the U.S. Army ever produced. Born into a military family, yet forever at odds with authority, Terry Allen carried rebellion in his blood. At West Point, he was brilliant, but reckless. His grades soared, his discipline collapsed. Expelled before graduation, he re-entered through persistence alone, a foreshadowing of the stubborn will that would later define him. He was a writer, a boxer, and, above all, a believer that war should be fought close enough to smell the enemy's breath. In the interwar years, he seemed destined to fade into obscurity, a restless officer in a peacetime army that had little use for daring men. But when the world ignited in 1939 and America began to stir from its isolation, Allen found his element. The battlefield, with all its terror and uncertainty, was the one place where his chaotic energy became an asset rather than a liability. When he was given command of the 1st Infantry Division in 1942, he reshaped it in his own image. Tough, resourceful, aggressive, and impossible to predict. The Germans, who prided themselves on precision, would soon discover that precision was powerless against madness executed with purpose. In the first battles of North Africa, the Allied forces stumbled badly. The Africa Corps, led by the legendary Erwin Rommel, sliced through green American units like a hot knife through butter. Panic spread, morale cracked, and commanders hesitated. But not Allen. He studied the terrain not as a map, but as a living opponent, its ridges, wadis, and dunes whispering tactical secrets that others ignored. When his peers argued for withdrawal, he gathered his officers under a dim lantern and said, "We don't back away. We make them pay for every foot of dirt they take." His language was raw, his eyes alight with the kind of intensity that made men believe him even when reason said they shouldn't. The next morning, as German tanks advanced toward an apparently broken American line, Allen's artillery opened fire at point-blank range. The blast so close that the recoil almost buried the gunners in sand. When the enemy tried to flank, infantry squads emerged from concealed positions and counterattacked with grenades and bayonets, screaming like madmen. By nightfall, Rommel's veterans were retreating, shocked not by superior numbers or technology, but by the sheer ferocity of resistance. Somewhere in the din of battle, an intercepted German transmission summed it up perfectly. "We are facing the Americans of General Allen. They fight like devils." That day marked the beginning of a reputation that would haunt the German army all the way to Sicily. Allen's leadership style defied every convention of military decorum. He was known to drive a jeep straight into the front lines, pistol on his hip, helmet tilted, shouting orders through the thunder of shell fire. He drank with his men, laughed with them, disciplined them harshly, and yet earned their loyalty in a way few generals could. To his soldiers, he wasn't a distant authority figure. He was one of them, older, louder, and possessed of a fearlessness that bordered on insanity. To the enemy, he was a phantom, appearing where logic said he shouldn't be, turning quiet sectors into slaughterhouses, transforming defensive missions into unexpected assaults. German prisoners spoke of him with bewildered respect. Allen's men, one said, do not know when to stop, and therein lay the secret of his legend, unpredictability. Allen understood that war was psychological before it was tactical. If the enemy believed you were capable of anything, then you already had the advantage. He cultivated that aura deliberately, using night attacks, false retreats, and even radio deception to make the Germans question their every move. It was this mastery of fear, both his own and his enemies', that made him so dangerous. He often told his officers, if you're scared, good. So am I. But we make them more scared. Under his command, fear became fuel. By the time the 1st Infantry Division stormed into Tunisia, Allen's legend had spread. German scouts were warned that if they saw the red numeral 1 painted on helmets, they were facing the division that never broke. Allied journalists began to write about the cowboy general who led from the front, while within the high command, more conservative officers muttered that he was reckless, insubordinate, even dangerous. But Eisenhower himself understood the value of a man who could turn defeat into determination. Allen gets results, he said simply, and in war, results were all that mattered. As the camera pans across the desert in our opening minute, viewers would see the shadow of a man standing atop a half-buried tank, wind ripping at his coat, binoculars raised toward a horizon on fire. The narration slows. The Germans called him terrible. His men called him fearless. History remembers him as both. The thunder of artillery fades into the low hum of suspense, because the story is only beginning. Behind the image of the fearless general lies a human being torn between chaos and control, haunted by the cost of every victory and driven by a purpose that no one fully understood. What made Terry Allen truly terrible was not his temper or his tactics. It was his refusal to accept that any battle, no matter how hopeless, was ever truly lost. The night deepened over the North African front, and the desert wind hissed through the shattered palm groves like an ancient whisper warning of blood to come. Terrible. Terry Allen walked among the foxholes with a cigarette burning between his fingers, the red ember flaring and fading as if in rhythm with the distant artillery flashes. He stopped beside a pair of exhausted infantrymen who were crouched over a malfunctioning radio. Without a word, he knelt, struck the set with the heel of his hand, and the static cleared into the clipped voice of a forward observer calling for fire. "You boys keep that alive," he growled, then stood, tugging his coat tighter against the chill. The men watched him disappear into the darkness, muttering the same line that echoed through every camp he touched. "He's out here with us." That presence, raw, unpredictable, magnetic, was what kept them fighting when logic said run. Allen's convoy was a ghost caravan threading through the dunes. Trucks moved without headlights, guided only by the glow of cigarettes and the shimmer of starlight on rifle barrels. Somewhere to the north, the Germans were regrouping after another failed push, their panzers hidden behind ridgelines, engines idling like predators in tall grass. Allen's scouts brought word that enemy armor would strike again at dawn. He didn't hesitate. "Then we hit them before the sun does," he said. It was madness to attack at night with half-trained troops and no air cover, but that was exactly why it worked. When the Americans erupted from the dark, firing tracer rounds that carved red scars across the horizon, the German front disintegrated. Confusion turned into panic. Men shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of engines and the shriek of shells. Allen stood on the hood of his Jeep, waving his pistol like a conductor summoning chaos, and for one surreal hour, the desert itself seemed to burn. By dawn, the field was silent except for the distant rumble of retreating tanks. Allen's officers found him sitting on an ammunition crate, face streaked with soot, laughing softly to himself. "They never expect crazy," he muttered. To the staff officers back at headquarters, this kind of recklessness was intolerable. Reports circulated accusing him of endangering men, wasting ammunition, disregarding protocol. But among the soldiers, the only people whose opinion truly mattered, his reputation became legend. They said Allen could smell weakness the way a wolf smells blood, that he'd walk through a firefight untouched because even bullets were afraid to get too close. They said he fought not for medals but for vengeance, as if every battle were a personal grudge against the enemy that had dared to doubt the American spirit. The Germans, meanwhile, learned to read the signs of his presence. A sudden shift in radio chatter, a burst of artillery without pattern, the eerie sound of bugles in the dark, all meant that terrible Terry Allen was near. Panzer officers briefed their crews with grim warnings. If you see red 1 patches, expect an attack from nowhere. Prisoners described their terror in hushed tones. One corporal, captured after a failed counterstrike, told his interrogators that Allen's troops fought like men who have lost everything but rage. Another compared the experience to being hunted. These stories spread faster than any Allied propaganda, seeding doubt inside the once invincible Wehrmacht. Back at his command post, Allen studied maps covered in grease pencil and sand. He understood that every victory came at a cost, measured not just in bodies but in faith. He had to keep his men believing that survival was possible, that their general was part of them, not above them. So he moved constantly, front line to rear, mess tent to foxhole, listening, joking, swearing, sharing their misery. He'd eat cold rations, sitting on the ground beside privates half his age, then rise abruptly and begin outlining the next assault as if comfort were an enemy in itself. You rest too long, he'd say. You start to think. Thinking gets you dead. It was crude wisdom, but it worked. Morale hardened into something unbreakable. When reporters visited the 1st Division, they were struck by how fiercely the men defended their general's reputation. He's rough, one sergeant admitted, but he's ours. Allen avoided interviews, preferring the company of mechanics and medics, people who kept the machine of war turning. Yet the legend grew without his help. Magazines back home began printing nicknames. The Mad General, the Devil of Tunisia, and letters from mothers arrived addressed simply to General Allen, the big red one somewhere in Africa. He read them all, sometimes in silence, sometimes aloud to his staff, as if to remind them that behind every bullet there was a prayer. The suspense of his story deepens here, because victory did not make him safer. It made him dangerous to his own hierarchy. Success bred scrutiny. Unconventional methods attracted jealous eyes. Allen's superiors tolerated his brilliance only as long as it produced results, and already there were whispers that his defiance bordered on insubordination. But Allen was beyond caring. He'd seen what happened when caution ruled war. Men died in orderly lines. He preferred chaos because chaos could be mastered by instinct. In that philosophy lay both his genius and his doom, and so the camera of our imagined documentary pans upward once more, leaving behind the battered encampment where dawn spreads pale light over broken vehicles and sleeping soldiers. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper. Before the war was over, he would conquer mountains, defy generals, and frighten the enemy more than any bomb. But before all that, terrible Terry Allen would face the one foe he could never outfight. His own command. The screen cuts to black. The music holds a single tense note, and the story hangs there alive, unfinished, pulling the viewer deeper. It was a war that turned ordinary men into legends. But among all the generals who commanded the might of the United States Army in World War II, none left the enemy trembling quite like Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen Sr. He wasn't the kind of officer who hid behind polished desks and perfect salutes. He was the kind who smelled of gunpowder, mud, and whiskey, a man who laughed louder the closer he came to death. To the Germans, he wasn't just another name on the Allied order of battle. He was Terrible Terry Allen, the devil in khaki who refused to fight war by the rules. His soldiers adored him, his superiors tolerated him, and his enemies feared him. Because wherever Allen's 1st Infantry Division marched, destruction followed. In the eerie calm before dawn in North Africa, 1943, his men crouched in foxholes, clutching rifles slick with sweat, staring into a horizon that glowed faintly with the promise of another day of blood. And then, out of the darkness, a voice echoed, rough, gravelly, confident. It was Allen, walking the line with a cigarette dangling from his lips, cracking jokes as German artillery began to wake the desert. "You boys ready to make history?" he asked. The men grinned back, not because they weren't afraid, but because if Terrible Terry wasn't afraid, neither were they. He'd been told he was reckless, that he pushed too hard, drank too much, broke too many rules. But Allen didn't care for rules, not when lives were on the line. He fought a different kind of war, close, dirty, personal. When other commanders studied maps miles from the front, he was already there, crawling through sand, whispering to his men, sharing the danger. The Germans, who prided themselves on discipline and precision, couldn't understand him. This brawling, loud-mouthed American who seemed to turn chaos into victory. They called him a madman, but his madness was method. Every attack, every ambush, every sudden push forward was built around one thing: the belief that courage was contagious. Show them no fear, he'd tell his officers. Fear spreads faster than fire. And so his men learned to move like a storm, sudden, violent, unstoppable. At Kasserine Pass, when the American line was collapsing under Rommel's armored assault, Allen's arrival turned panic into fury. He stood atop a burning jeep, bullets whizzing past, screaming at retreating troops to turn around. "You want to live forever?" he roared. They didn't, not that day. Under Allen's command, they counterattacked, savage, unrelenting, a swarm of desperate men fighting for each other. German officers reported that the Americans had gone berserk, charging through smoke and shell fire like men possessed. When Rommel's tanks finally withdrew, the desert was littered with twisted metal, smoldering wrecks, and bodies. But the 1st Infantry stood firm. Allen had given them back their soul. He wasn't the kind of general Washington liked to promote. He drank whiskey in tin cups, gambled with his soldiers, and swore like a dock worker. His uniform was never spotless, his manners never polished. But his results, they were undeniable. "Give me Allen's division," one Allied officer once said, "and I'll take any hill in Europe." The Germans learned this the hard way. Intercepted radio messages described him as the aggressive American devil. They began to recognize his tactics, the sudden night strikes, the feints followed by crushing assaults, the eerie music of bugles before dawn. And whenever they heard that sound, they knew who was coming. Terrible. Terry Allen didn't fight for medals or politics. He fought for his men. As Europe burned and the Allied push gained momentum, Allen became something of a legend. Yet legends come with shadows. His superiors in Washington saw him as too wild, too unpredictable, a warrior from another age. But his soldiers, the big red one, would have followed him into hell. "He made us believe," one veteran said years later. "When Allen was there, you felt 10 feet tall." His secret wasn't strategy, it was empathy, disguised under a rough grin and a booming voice. He understood fear because he felt it himself, and he taught his men how to master it. That's why they fought harder, longer, and meaner than anyone else. But Allen's story wasn't just about glory. It was about defiance, against the enemy, against bureaucracy, against the very idea that war could be fought cleanly. He refused to sanitize battle. "You can't win a war from behind a desk," he'd growl. "You've got to smell it, taste it, bleed with your boys." And bleed he did. In Sicily, when mortar fire tore through his command post, Allen refused evacuation until every wounded man had been carried out first. The Germans came to believe he couldn't be killed and that luck itself bent around him. To his troops, he was more than a leader. He was a shield. By the time the Allies marched into Europe, his reputation had already crossed enemy lines. German prisoners spoke of him with a strange mix of hatred and admiration. They feared his unpredictability, the way he'd strike when least expected. To them, he was America personified, loud, relentless, and impossible to intimidate. And yet, for all his bravado, there were moments when even terrible Terry Allen fell silent, moments when he walked alone among the dead, lighting a cigarette for each fallen soldier, whispering something no one else could hear. He wasn't just leading men. He was carrying them. He knew every victory came with a cost too high to count. Still, the war didn't wait for grief. New battles were coming. New enemies were preparing. And somewhere in the distance, the thunder of German guns began again, a reminder that the devil they feared wasn't done with them yet. As the 1st Infantry Division advanced through the rugged hills of Tunisia, Allen's presence was like a storm rolling over the desert. Every ridge, every valley became a stage for his audacious tactics. Under his command, small squads executed lightning raids that left German units scattered and bewildered. He did not simply lead from the rear. He immersed himself in the battle, crawling alongside soldiers through mud, shouting orders through the roar of artillery, and sometimes standing atop overturned vehicles to direct fire with pinpoint accuracy. Each movement was calculated yet seemed chaotic, a deliberate paradox that kept the enemy guessing at every turn. Terrible. Terry Allen's strategy relied not on conventional formations, but on adaptability, instinct, and the psychological edge that came from unpredictability. Allen's men were inspired and terrified in equal measure. They witnessed their general personally intervening when units faltered, repositioning men under heavy fire, and rescuing the wounded with no thought for his own safety. One soldier later recounted how Allen, seeing a squad pinned by machine gun fire, leapt into the line of fire, firing his pistol and waving his men forward, and by the time the squad regrouped, the enemy had been driven back, demoralized, and scattered. Stories like this spread rapidly across the division, cementing Allen's legend. He became both an example and an enigma, someone who demanded courage while embodying it beyond measure. The Germans, on the other hand, were increasingly unnerved. Intercepted communications described an officer whose tactics seemed impossible to anticipate, a leader who would strike when it was least expected and vanish as if into thin air. Panzer commanders began to adjust strategies, overthinking every move, hesitating in situations that required decisiveness, all because terrible Terry Allen had instilled fear and uncertainty. Even the most disciplined troops found themselves second-guessing their orders, wondering where the next strike would come from. In the minds of enemy soldiers, Allen was not merely a general. He was an unpredictable force of nature, a figure who warped the battlefield simply through presence and audacity. Allen's reputation for fearless leadership was matched only by his unorthodox methods of ensuring effectiveness. He would frequently visit artillery crews during bombardments, offering advice, encouragement, or sharp reprimands. He believed every soldier, regardless of rank, played a critical role in survival and victory. Even when he was exhausted or wounded, he refused to relinquish command until the objective was secured. His relentless drive and hands-on leadership style forged an esprit de corps that few units in the Allied forces could match, turning ordinary men into cohesive, deadly fighting teams. Beyond tactical brilliance, Allen understood the psychological elements of war. He employed deception, false retreats, and misdirection with the skill of a master chess player. By creating uncertainty and fear within enemy ranks, he manipulated the battlefield in ways that allowed his forces to strike decisively while minimizing casualties. These tactics were not simply theoretical. They were battle-tested and honed over the harsh desert campaigns, and their success was evident in the morale of his troops and the growing dread among German units. Reports from prisoners indicated that German officers had come to view engagements with Allen's division as traps, their carefully laid plans unraveling in the face of his unpredictable, aggressive maneuvers. In addition to his leadership in battle, Allen maintained a presence that inspired loyalty beyond the fighting itself. He shared hardships with his men, ate the same rations, and endured the same brutal conditions. His willingness to suffer alongside his soldiers reinforced the bond between commander and troops, strengthening cohesion and resilience. In interviews and memoirs, veterans repeatedly recalled how this commitment transformed fear into determination, turning moments of near defeat into displays of relentless courage. The psychological impact of Allen's leadership cannot be overstated. It was as critical to victory as his tactical ingenuity. By the time the Allies had solidified their foothold in North Africa, Allen had already left a trail of decisive engagements, legendary maneuvers, and an enduring aura of intimidation. His name circulated throughout German units with a mix of fear and respect, and Allied command recognized his unique ability to inspire and lead. The combination of fearlessness, tactical brilliance, and unorthodox methods ensured that wherever Terrible Terry Allen went, the battlefront transformed into a theater of relentless aggression and uncanny strategy. Even in moments of apparent calm, Allen's presence created tension and readiness. He drilled his men constantly, ensuring they remained alert and capable of responding to any threat. He monitored supplies, logistics, and the condition of troops, understanding that victory relied not only on combat skill, but also on meticulous preparation. Each decision, each patrol, each engagement reflected a balance of calculated risk and audacious leadership. And his men internalized this ethos, carrying it into every confrontation. The legend of Terrible Terry Allen, therefore, was not simply born of daring exploits or battlefield heroics. It was the result of a comprehensive mastery of warfare that fused strategy, psychology, and personal courage. Every engagement reinforced his reputation. Every maneuver spread fear through enemy ranks, and every victory, no matter how costly, cemented the notion that Allen's leadership was a force unto itself, capable of shaping the course of battle and inspiring awe among those who fought beside him. As the campaign in North Africa progressed, Allen's reputation grew not only among his own men but across the entire Allied command structure. Commanders who had once doubted his methods began to witness the results of his audacity and relentlessness. Reports of successful engagements that seemed impossible under conventional tactics filtered back to headquarters, detailing victories achieved with minimal losses despite overwhelming enemy numbers. Every maneuver, whether a sudden night attack, an aggressive counterattack against superior forces, or a feint that drew the enemy into a trap, bore the unmistakable stamp of Allen's vision. He transformed ordinary battlegrounds into landscapes of calculated chaos, where the German forces could not predict, anticipate, or counter his movements effectively. This unpredictability became his greatest weapon. Allen's men described him as omnipresent, a figure whose energy and intensity never waned, even when exhaustion threatened to break lesser men. He moved among the troops like a living emblem of courage, inspecting trenches, delivering supplies, and encouraging soldiers as if his mere presence could bolster their resolve. In one instance, during a prolonged siege, Allen personally led a small squad to reinforce a vulnerable flank. Under heavy artillery fire, he climbed atop a ruined wall to direct the defenders, his voice cutting through the chaos. The men, invigorated by his fearless example, held their positions, repelling repeated German assaults. Stories like this spread quickly, reinforcing his mythos not just as a competent commander, but as a living embodiment of American defiance and aggression. Enemy forces were not blind to his effectiveness. German intelligence began to track his movements, noting the timing, intensity, and unconventional strategies employed by his division. Reports circulated that captured German officers described Allen's troops as fighting like possessed men, and that his presence caused hesitation among commanders who were otherwise confident in their superior training and weaponry. The psychological impact of Allen's leadership became a force multiplier, as enemy units, anticipating unpredictability, frequently delayed or botched maneuvers, providing Allen and his men opportunities to exploit weaknesses and secure objectives. Allen's approach to leadership was deeply human. He understood that morale, fear, and motivation were as crucial as firepower. He cultivated loyalty and cohesion by sharing in the hardships of his troops, by acknowledging their fears and challenges, and by demonstrating again and again that he would never ask of them anything he would not do himself. Whether it was enduring sweltering desert heat, sharing limited rations, or exposing himself to the same dangers as his soldiers, Allen's example was a constant lesson in courage and commitment. This connection between leader and soldier created a culture of trust, resilience, and determination, which in turn amplified the combat effectiveness of the 1st Infantry Division in ways that purely mechanical strategies could never achieve. As battles intensified, Allen's tactics evolved. He began to integrate deception, misdirection, and psychological warfare into every operation. Convoys were deliberately exposed to lure enemy fire, only to spring hidden ambushes. Positions were abandoned to create the illusion of retreat, drawing opposing forces into vulnerable positions. Every decision, from the allocation of resources to the timing of assaults, was crafted to maximize uncertainty for the enemy while maintaining control and adaptability within his own ranks. This approach required constant vigilance, sharp intuition, and unwavering confidence, qualities that Allen possessed in abundance. The relentless tempo of operations took a toll on both men and machinery, yet Allen's leadership ensured that performance never faltered. Engineers, mechanics, and logistical teams worked tirelessly to repair vehicles, maintain weaponry, and ensure that his division remained combat-ready. Allen was a constant presence among them, emphasizing the importance of every role and reinforcing the idea that victory depended on the cohesion of all elements, not just the front-line soldiers. The resulting efficiency and readiness allowed his troops to execute complex operations with precision, often outmaneuvering and outlasting forces that were numerically or technologically superior. Even in moments of apparent calm, Allen's mind never rested. He meticulously studied maps, monitored reports, and developed contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. Yet despite this planning, he remained fluid, adaptable, and willing to take risks that others would consider reckless. This combination of preparation and audacity made him uniquely effective. He was able to seize fleeting opportunities in battle while maintaining strategic coherence. His men trusted his judgment implicitly, following his lead into situations that would have terrified less disciplined or less confident soldiers. By the end of the North African campaign, Terrible Terry Allen's legend had been firmly established. He was a commander who combined daring, intuition, and psychological insight in ways that few had ever seen. Enemy forces approached his positions with trepidation. His own soldiers approached him with loyalty bordering on reverence. And historians would later note that his impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories he achieved. The combination of leadership, courage, and cunning created a force that was more than the sum of its parts. A division that could strike fear into well-trained adversaries and inspire the same awe among allies. Allen's influence reached into every aspect of the battlefield experience, from the individual courage of a rifleman holding his position under fire to the coordinated maneuvers of entire battalions. His presence shaped outcomes at every level. He demonstrated repeatedly that leadership was not simply about command. It was about engagement, understanding, and the ability to project confidence and purpose in circumstances of extreme danger. His approach exemplified the integration of human will, tactical innovation, and psychological mastery, creating an enduring template for effective military leadership. As the war in Europe reached its crescendo, Terrible Terry Allen's legend had already become the stuff of whispered awe among both Allied soldiers and the enemy alike. For by this time, his name alone was capable of striking fear into hardened German officers who had faced countless campaigns and experienced every form of battlefield terror imaginable, yet none had confronted a figure who combined audacity, tactical genius, and an almost mythic disregard for personal safety in a single commanding presence. From the snow-laden hills of Sicily to the treacherous bocage of Normandy, Allen moved with a forceful immediacy that turned ordinary operations into extraordinary triumphs. Each engagement a symphony of chaos meticulously orchestrated by a general whose instincts seemed preternatural, whose decisions in the heat of battle were both reckless and precise, and whose soldiers, hardened by months of relentless fighting, followed him not merely because of duty, but because in his presence they believed in the possibility of survival and victory against impossible odds, a belief that became a contagious and almost tangible energy coursing through every unit. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, Allen's leadership style remained unchanged, audacious and terrifyingly effective, utilizing deception, surprise, and the sheer force of will to create opportunities where none existed. Striking German positions when they thought themselves safe, emerging from the fog of war with calculated ferocity, and leaving behind the psychological imprint of a commander who could appear anywhere, strike decisively and vanish as if the desert, mountains, or fields themselves obeyed his command, while his men, inspired and loyal, carried forward his vision, executing complex operations with precision and courage that defied exhaustion, fear, and the relentless grind of prolonged combat. Each victory feeding the mythos that Allen himself neither sought nor claimed, yet which grew unstoppable as historians later pieced together the scope of his accomplishments and the effect he had on both sides of the conflict. For the Germans learned that even the most prepared unit could crumble before the ingenuity, unpredictability, and sheer aggression that Allen brought to the field, his reputation crossing front lines and theaters, and instilling dread in commanders and soldiers alike who recognized that facing terrible Terry Allen was not simply facing a division of Americans, but confronting the living embodiment of audacity and determination. And in the final months of the war, as Allied armies pushed into Germany itself, Allen continued to lead from the front, personally overseeing attacks, coordinating with armored and infantry units in a way that kept the enemy off balance, and ensuring that every maneuver was executed with the same blend of courage, ferocity, and tactical brilliance that had defined his career from the sands of North Africa onward. And though exhaustion, injury, and the ceaseless demands of command weighed upon him, he remained unflinching, his presence both a shield and a rallying point for his troops. And as victory neared, the culmination of his daring and leadership could be measured not only in territory gained or battles won, but in the indelible mark he left upon every man who served under him, every enemy forced to retreat, and every historian who would later marvel at the audacity, effectiveness, and raw human courage of a general who became more than a leader, more than a tactician, more than a soldier, but a symbol of fearless resolve, a man who, through brilliance, recklessness, and uncompromising will, ensured that the Germans feared not just the firepower of the Americans, but the unpredictable, unstoppable spirit of terrible Terry Allen. And as the screen would fade to black, leaving the echoes of distant artillery and the roar of determined men, viewers are left suspended in awe, contemplating the relentless courage, the mastery of chaos, and the transformative impact of a single general who turned every battlefield into a testament of fearlessness and ingenuity, ensuring that the story of terrible Terry Allen would endure forever, inspiring generations with the reminder that true leadership combines vision, bravery, and the willingness to risk everything to achieve the impossible, a legacy so compelling that it commands attention until the very last frame, leaving hearts pounding and minds captivated by the extraordinary life and war of the most feared American general the Germans ever faced.